The Vietnam War was one of the most controversial and infamous campaigns in the military history of the United States, and is often remembered for the brutal actions carried out by the U.S. High General Staff, since, of the more than 3 million recorded deaths on Vietnamese territory, at least 2 million were civilians. Much of the blood spilled in Cambodian villages is on the hands of Washington generals, who saw their ends as justification for their means, and dropped tons of explosives or, even worse, napalm on defenseless towns, schools, and hospitals. But even within the questionable decisions made by the United States Army and Air Force, there have been events that transcended not only as tactical errors, but as macabre war crimes. These massacres, normally carried out on Vietnamese civilians who had nothing to do with the Viet Cong guerrillas, watered the soil of the troubled country with the blood of tens of thousands of innocents, and showed that even those who had managed to liberate the country from the communist yoke could be just as cruel as their hated enemies. Join us in a new episode of Military History to learn about the most brutal massacres that the United States Army committed during its campaign in Vietnam. Are you ready? Let's start. The best way to start is the tip of the iceberg, the first great massacre registered by the North American justice system as a war crime committed by its own forces. We are referring, of course, to the mass murder perpetrated by U.S. soldiers in My Lai. On March 16, 1968, U.S. troops launched an operation to find, capture, and eliminate Viet Cong terrorist forces. Unlike other operations, the Americans had decided to stop fighting blindly in the jungle, and considered that the most effective thing would be to enter the villages, where they suspected that the enemy guerrillas were hiding, behind a facade of innocent civilians. Second Lieutenant William Calley was in charge of Infantry Company C, which was ordered to advance on the My Lai sector, in the Sun My region of South Vietnam. The soldiers were deployed in helicopters, between which they moved towards the outskirts of a medium-sized village. The mission was to interrogate the locals, locate any terror suspects, and return to the helicopters. But things did not turn out this way. Arriving at the town, the Americans found that there were no middle-aged adult men, only women, children, and the elderly remained. It was never really clear if what happened next was an act of hate, madness, or simple abuse of power, but it would be the first massive criminal act in the history of this war. The American soldiers raped all the women and girls in the village of My Lai for 4 hours. They also killed cattle, destroyed crops, and set fire to buildings, until the entire village was reduced to ashes. After executing all this, they shot the civilians in cold blood. The number of executed victims is estimated to be between 300 and 500 South Vietnamese. They then returned to the helicopters and headed back to the base, without a single suspect of cooperating with the Viet Cong. The My Lai massacre would be the first crime condemned under the term democide, that is, the murder of any person or group of people by a government, including genocide, political assassinations, and mass murders. A few months later, at the end of 1968, Operation Speedy Express would take place, in which the Americans carried out a series of raids on towns near the Mekong River Delta. Although at first the missions consisted of directly confronting Viet Cong cells located in the area, things quickly got out of hand. Hospitals began to receive a huge number of civilians wounded or on the verge of death. The villages were suddenly empty. The Americans advanced along the Mekong, sweeping everything in their path. In 1969, when Speedy Express went public, the first allegations against the United States infantry, as well as its Air Force, also appeared. U.S. infantrymen launched surprise attacks on civilian towns in the middle of the night, surrounding the locals and annihilating them with machine gun fire as they ran for their lives or their children. But this was not just a decision of the captains. The order came from the generals. As it was learned later through the investigations of the Russell Commission, which judged this type of crime, the highest positions rewarded the brigades that had the highest death counts to their credit. This led to American rifles being much more active, even against citizens who had nothing to do with the rebels. The official data of the time ensured that, during the Speedy Express operation, some 10,889 enemies were killed. The Russell Commission found that of that number, between 5,000 and 7,000 victims were unarmed civilians. Finally, it is impossible to address the issue of war crimes in Vietnam and not mention what was probably the most sinister brigade among U.S. troops. We are talking about the Tiger Force, a long-range reconnaissance squadron belonging to the United States Army Airborne Corps. Made up of about 45 paratroopers, this platoon terrorized the Vietnamese between 1965 and 1967. Its task was to participate in special or commando operations against the guerrillas, using the terrorist group's own tactics, in an attempt by the U.S. High Command to combat fire with fire. But this idea, which seemed so great to them at first, led the Tiger Force to find no moral impediment when carrying out the most terrible actions on whoever crossed their path, whether it was an armed guerrilla or an innocent civilian. By 1968, the Tiger Force was one of the most decorated battalions in the Army, due to its effectiveness in eliminating threats. They had been trained to kill, and they completed their duty to perfection. Many years later, it was discovered that these war machines had overstepped all moral bounds, and had performed some of the most despicable criminal acts. Stories of the constant torture to which they subjected their prisoners before murdering them came to light. They also raped, beat and executed hundreds of civilians. One of their most macabre traits was their fondness for cutting off the ears of their victims, and using them in accessories such as necklaces, in full view of the whole world. The more human ears a Tiger Force soldier had, the greater his honor. On some occasions, they also dedicated themselves to cutting the scalp of the people they murdered, and even did so as a method of torture. One of their most heinous crimes was when they decapitated a baby in front of its own mother's eyes, and then executed the woman. Since 2004, the investigation file on the Tiger Force has been kept open, to consider how these terrible criminal acts will be judged. After going through all the details about the most sinister massacres in Vietnam, we want to know your opinion. Do you think that the Americans encouraged this type of criminal behavior in their soldiers, or that they did not know how to contain the murderous acts of men? Leave your answer in the comment box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. This was all in a new episode of Military History. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. And stay tuned for our next video.